Okay. All right. The stream is live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Watching 100 Movies. I am Christiana Ellis,
I'm Mike Mateen.
and tonight we are doing a David Fincher special. We are talking about three of his best known movies, I guess, and we selected Fight Club, Panic Room, and Zodiac as representative of his career, and we're going to talk about them. It's not that complicated, really. It's a pretty straightforward premise for a show.
Yep.
Um,
And we've been doing it for a while.
yeah. Uh, so just on the general topic of the show, I did find it really interesting watching through these three movies, just because, like, you can definitely see, like, he's got a lot of stylistic traits, like in ways that he likes to make movies. But it's interesting that he gets, at least with these three movies, he gets kind of more and more subtle with the stylization over time, right? Like it doesn't go away, but it's not like in your face as much. Like Fight Club, like, is aggressively stylized, right?
Hmm.
And then Panic Room does a lot of stylistic stuff, like, but only specifically for effect, like not for its own sake, but specifically to accomplish certain things. And then in Zodiac, it's almost invisible, but it's there if you're looking for it.
Yeah. I think there was only one scene that it was like really caught my eye. I can't remember what they were doing. They're like standing around and like there's something in the foreground that's like not part of the actual foreground. I can't remember what it was, whether it was newspaper headlines or something like that.
Mm,
That was the only one where it was like, oh, this is like a thing,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So in any case, that was just something I thought was interesting, just because I don't know. I guess maybe my gut would expect the reverse, like for a director to not necessarily have such a distinct directorial voice early on and then develop it over their career. And while I think there is certainly development, it's interesting that the development has actually been kind of to get more subtle with it and more controlled.
Well, and I think it actually makes sense for him because the majority of his career before movies was music videos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
So that would probably explain why he came in with a style, and that voice was more his music video style voice, and then the edges kind of softened to more of a movie style.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about his career, leading up to these movies. So like as you mentioned, in the 80s, just tons and tons of music videos. Just scrolling through the list right now, we got Rick Springfield, Dance This World Away. Uh,
Pretty
uh,
much all of Paula Abdul and Madonna's music
oh
videos in
yeah,
the 80s were done by him.
yeah. So worked for with a lot of different people. Um, I'm not enough of someone who's into music to have a total sense of like all of this, but Iggy Pop, Billy Idol, Madonna, like you said, George Michael, lots of people. But all of that leads right up to where he makes his leap to feature filmmaking, with the obvious jump from music videos, Alien 3. Which I actually rewatched about a year and a half ago. And it's it's interesting, right? Like you can see the potential there. I feel like it has a lot of problems, and it makes a couple of storytelling choices that really irritate me as a fan of Alien and Aliens. In particular, deciding to kill off half the cast of Aliens off screen just because you didn't want to deal with them, I guess. I don't know. I think it felt like it was supposed to be like shocking and upsetting, but it was, but in a way that just felt like way to just invalidate the climax of a better movie. But there's a lot of interesting things in there. I think it's definitely like I, it's a fascinating film, especially if you watch the the different versions of it, and you can see the talent in there, right? And there's lots more music videos. And then it looks like I think his yeah. So that was in 1992, and his next feature isn't until 95. But that's where he does Seven, and obviously, like Alien 3 was big because it was already in a franchise, but Seven is the one where he really makes a name for himself as a filmmaker who can shows that he can make a hit out of something that wasn't already going to have people going to it.
Right.
Now, I haven't rewatched Seven in a long time, but it is certainly one of those movies that has just entered the landscape, right? I mean, memes and so on of, what's in the box? What's in the box, right? It's like it's people remember Seven.
Yeah, I mean that was a meme that took hold for a couple of weeks in 2022.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a 15, 22, 37 years.
Yeah. Yep.
No, 27, 20, 27 years. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, yeah. But and then he's still not done making music videos. There's still a couple of those. But then in '97 he makes The Game with Michael Douglas, which is another one I haven't rewatched in a long time. But I mean, I remember being, entertained by it at the time. But I think that one did well. But then in 1999 we get to the first of the three that we've decided to talk about today, Fight Club, which is his next like big hit, and I think probably still might be like if you asked the average moviegoer, I think this would probably be his best known movie. Do you think?
I would think so. Yeah. If you show them all the list of all these movies,
Yeah, yeah,
it's held longer than Seven. I mean, Seven, obviously, like we said, it still has some things, but
yeah.
this movie, I mean, people quote this movie like
People got obsessed with this movie,
yes,
in a way that like we're gonna talk about it. In fact, we're ready to do exactly that. So, uh, I know that you had read the book previously, and you actually reread it for the purpose of the podcast. So,
yes.
do you want to start with what's your take on the movie? What do you feel like you have to say about it?
I mean, I I love this movie, and I'm trying to think of the right way to say this because I know it's something we're going to get into. Uh, because this movie has there's a lot to it, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's not a simple message. It's capturing a lot of things that speak to a lot of people. Um, but I love it. I love what it's done, and there's essentially there's actually in the book, like I'll get in more of the book as when it's necessary, but there's actually in the copy I have, there's a good afterword by Chuck Palahniuk, just post movie everything and just kind of the reception of this movie,
Mm-hmm.
and the talk about like how he always gets asked like how do you where are these fight clubs, how do you start them, like news reporters always want to talk to him, and like his response is like, are you worried about copycats with all the stuff that goes on in here? And his response was really simple. He's like, look, I'm a blue collar guy from Oregon. Like, I couldn't invent all of this stuff. I'm not creative enough. He's like, all I did was take things that I knew people had done, put a through line to them, and took them to like the natural conclusion if you actually organized all this chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what he's doing, is taking. And so what I really like is it speaks all these things of like how you kind of get the feeling like there's the reasons why they want to be in Fight Club that people feel, right? Like why they start Fight Club, like that's a real
Mm-hmm.
hole that people have, right?
Yeah.
There's all the theme about kind of not necessarily. I mean, the character is specifically abandoned by his father, like that's
Mm-hmm.
to make a point, but it's the feeling of not of being sort of like latchkey kid type thing, like there's sort of this disconnect with people and their parents, and there's the book is actually much more in the whole like relationship to their father and their relationship to God, and kind of like,
Mm-hmm.
again, because it's kind of drawing that same thing of like that's filling that same hole, right? It's all about trying to get, like, there's a whole chapter in there about how they're doing this because they'd rather God notice them for something, right,
Mm-hmm.
than just not worry, than them just being blank, right? And so they're trying to get his attention. Like that's kind of a thing in there.
Yeah.
And so all those feelings are all real, right? And the caste system thing, and like, hey, we're all the doers, and there's these elitists, and we actually could have, if we took the power, we have it because there's more of us, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like those are real feelings. But then I do like what the story does, and it says, but yeah, if you live that out in this sort of nihilistic, Armageddon way, it doesn't lead to good things. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I love that it tells the story that way,
Mm-hmm.
and that it makes our main character, like the guy who's able to organize the chaos, is insane. And not like, that's not hyperbole. Like he
Mm-hmm.
is insane. you know? And so to use that as like, sort of the catalyst, and it's like, I love all of that, right? And where I sometimes think the movie, and I know you feel this way too, gets misremembered, is it's almost like people want to forget the conclusion
Mm-hmm.
and love the response, and what it's doing to fill those empty feelings and those things that it's latching onto.
Right.
And there's tons of themes. I mean, there's the corporate culture, and like feeling like a, just a drone in the, you know which that's, I think, again, it's clearly in the movie, but it's much more apparent in the book, that it's like, when nobody cares that he comes in with the shit beat out of him every week, because they just mind their own business. Like he's just like this cog in this wheel in the corporation. As long as he does his job, like people are like, I don't want to know his business.
Well, like
Yeah.
we'll talk more about. I want to talk more about that specific element of it, maybe in a minute. But I don't want to
Yeah.
like interrupt you.
No, I was just saying, I'm just kind of tapping in the whole thing
Mm-hmm.
about like, the consumerism, and like living a lifestyle where everything's selected out of a catalog. Like it's taking these things that are real.
Mm-hmm.
Like people have, like, there's a real sort of staleness to like in how some interior design works, and
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't tap into this, but it's like, the reality is, like, some of these things are like human things, right? Like what they're taking, like everybody having the heterogeneous apartment is the same as all these guys wanting to be in Fight Club together. Like it's they're weird extremes of the same tribalism,
Right. Yeah.
right? Yeah. So
Yeah. So I mean, I guess I don't want to. Is that kind of
yeah, that's kind of, I
so
just, like
I?
I said, I really enjoy it because of all of the things that it puts in there, and that
Mm-hmm.
that it's not a simple, it's not saying this very simple message, is tapping into a lot of things, and it does all of them very well, and I like how it draws them through. I enjoy that. Yeah.
Yeah, you kind of touched on it, and because we've certainly over the years, you and I have talked about this movie more than once. Because it comes up, in terms of film discussion, not just here right now, but when you talk about movies, it's one of the movies that surfaces as interesting and worthy of discussion. But I personally find it extremely frustrating because I think that there's no question about, like, for me, there's no question, a lot of the things that you said I agree with wholeheartedly. It's obviously tapping into a real thing that a lot of people feel. It is pretty brilliant in the way that it satirizes a lot of elements of consumerism and all of that sort of thing. Um, I do like that if you are paying attention, it does say those things that you're talking about, which is to show that despite the appeal of these things like the fight clubs, that the actual end point of that line of thinking is not good. But I think I can't comment on the book because I haven't read it, but the movie I think is not particularly good at selling that second half of the story. I feel like the people who find the things like Fight Club glamorous do not at any point in the movie stop thinking it's cool.
Right.
I think they think it's cool right up until the end, and they cheer when those buildings blow up.
I
And
think there.
yeah, and so it raises a really interesting question, broadly speaking, of art and the responsibility of the artist versus the responsibility of the audience, right? Because it's one thing to say the intention of the movie is to show the dark places these ways of thinking can go, and to try to present it more like a cautionary tale. But and so to some extent, if that's the intent, there's going to be some people who don't see that and misinterpret it. But to some extent, if art is meant to be communication, and a huge component of the audience does not receive the intended message, is that not a failing of the art? That's a broader, more philosophical question. We don't have
Yeah.
to go too far into, but it was something I was thinking about recently, because I've been watching a lot of the movies of Jonathan Demme, because listening to Backlog of the Blank Check podcast, and they're doing a series on him. And his best known movie, of course, would be Silence of the Lambs. And a lot of people, like myself included, could not have, before going through this process, named another one of his movies, just because he's made a lot of movies that I had heard of, but I didn't necessarily think of him as the director of them. But one of the things about Silence of the Lambs, which is a great movie, is that it does have the problem where, even though the characters go out of their way to include dialogue to say, both Clarice and Hannibal say, Buffalo Bill is not a transsexual. That's not what's going on with him. It's superficially similar, but it has a deeply different underlying purpose. Right? Like, they go out of their way to make that clear, and yet, for decades, when people who don't know any trans people think of trans people, they think of Buffalo Bill. Right? And to some extent, even if the movie is trying to say it's not the same, what message did the movie actually communicate to the people who watched it? Right? And that, I'm not saying that makes it a bad movie, right?
Right.
It doesn't. It doesn't. Silence of the Lambs is a great movie, but I think it's important to talk about some of those things. And so that's part of why I had some of this stuff in mind when I was watching Fight Club. But, like, for example, with Jonathan Demme, he was so upset by realizing that that had happened and that people were taking it that way, that his next movie was Philadelphia, where he was specifically trying to make a movie about empathy for gay people and LGBTQ people in general, right?
Right.
And that was at a time where that was not commonplace yet. So it was and so that engagement with the audience perception, I think, is interesting. And this is not to dump on David Fincher. That's not what I'm trying to get at here. Because I think Fight Club does a lot of things extremely well. And if you're watching it carefully and you have the ability to think critically about media, you can see that it does say that you should not, like, these Fight Club things are not good. You can see where the appeal comes from, and you can see that it's trying to present as a cautionary tale. But I think it's nonetheless true that I think if if you found all the people in the world who said that Fight Club was one of their top 10 favorite movies, I would bet that most of them like it for the fight parts and don't care about the rest.
Yeah.
And so I think that, like, it doesn't make the movie bad, but I think that I can see where the movie goes wrong that produced that outcome, which is just to say, it's like the whole thing of, like, can you really make an anti-war movie, because the medium of cinema kind of inherently glamorizes the conflict, the violence.
Yeah. And that was one thing I was going to get to, is that, so this is one of those, again, I don't want, I mean, our whole discussion doesn't need to be tying the book to the movie, but I think it is relevant
Sure,
because
yeah.
it is the source material, and the book is or the movie's fairly true to it, minus some nuances, which are actually some of the things you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But it when you they it's a these are one of those, there's not a lot of these out there where, at least that I've read, where I feel like the movie and the book can both exist in the same universe, even though they're telling the exact same story. They do it a little bit differently,
Mm-hmm.
but they're using their medium the way that the medium is designed, right? Like the book is very stylistic too, which is why probably part of why he leaned into sort of his music video style. Like there's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of that. Like it was originally written as a short story and then was expanded, but it has this weird cadence and beat to it on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of style in the early part of the movie really lends itself to, but just takes it to another level that the book can't do because it can't
Mm-hmm.
use the visuals and the music and Brad Pitt and why am I drawing a blank on my
Edward
other main
Norton.
character, Edward Norton, yeah, and
Yeah.
Edward Norton and like their personalities. Um, so I don't I would never get into, if someone said, "Well, do you like the book or the movie better?" I don't like either better. I like both.
Mm-hmm.
They're the same story, but they're told a little differently. And some of it's like small things, like in the book, uh, the main character, he also doesn't have a name in the book, but
Mm-hmm.
the narrator, um, he narrates the whole book, which is obviously evident in the movie, but he has no dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
Like he says that I talked to him and I said this, but
Right.
he's never in a piece of dialogue with anyone.
Mm-hmm.
It's just he says I told him this or I said this to him, and so it's like but it's so he's still communicating with people, but
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of, it leaves him sort of like off and never like fully engaged, right? Like he almost
Right.
seems like an observer, which makes sense in the sense of how he
Yeah,
thinks.
yeah. I mean, that's the primary issue of this character is that he's so alienated from his fellow human beings.
Right, that he's sort of and he's like an observer of his own story and world,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that when he wants to get involved, he takes on the persona of Tyler. But other than that, he's kind of like somewhat, there's sort of a little bit removed from
Right.
everybody. So that kind of thing, like just that cadence that comes with, they're in the middle of, like, if three people are talking and he's one of them, like the other two are
Mm-hmm.
talking, but he never dialogues with them. Like
Yeah.
it's kind of leaves this weird feeling. So that's one part of it. Um, it is also, it has because it's all narrated by him, right? Like, so there isn't, well, we're going to show you this part and then he's going to kind of talk and say the fun catchy lines and feeling, because those things are all in there. Like most of the coolest lines in the movie
Mm-hmm.
that impact people are all straight from the book, but to get from those lines you have to still describe what's happening and how he's feeling about things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's much darker, you know in the book, like from the beginning. Like I feel like there's a couple things they hedged in the movie. Like they made Edward Norton a little bit more of a hero,
Mm.
and like Brad Pitt the villain, kind of in that second half that you're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
where he's, even when he realizes what's happening, like he's not really the hero. Like he's
Right.
understanding that these are all real parts of him, and he kind of agrees with some of this stuff, and he just didn't realize he was doing all of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
um Even from the beginning, like there's still a little bit of a darker undertone to like why they're doing it all. Like, I use that term nihilistic. Like it's much more evident in the book. Like
Mm-hmm.
they have like discussions where like their end game is like complete Armageddon. Like basically they want it to look like, some of the things they describe is like what The Last of Us looks like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah. Well,
that's what they
Brad Pitt
want.
has a brief monologue in the movie where he talks about that. That being his, like, basically taking humanity back to hunter gatherers, where with overgrown skyscrapers and stuff like that. And I
Right.
hear that and I'm thinking, it's like, yeah, that sounds great if you're a strong, good-looking guy who doesn't
Right.
have
And so
any health problems or, you know.
that's much more powerful when
Mm-hmm.
it's told from our sort of, from our schizophrenic narrator perspective, and that like
Mm-hmm.
he's kind of like wants that too. So what more happens is that he starts to realize like this has gotten out of his sort of control. Not that he didn't want those things at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Like he always, like, so that dark stuff was happening at the
Right. Yeah.
beginning. It also hedges a little bit on like, what they are actually doing in Project Mayhem. Like there's a lot more death in the book. Like
Well,
they're
that
dying.
I
Yeah.
think is a big problem with the movie. and in exactly this element that I'm talking about. And so there is a part towards the end where when it's been revealed that they're going to blow up the buildings, and Ed Norton is like, "But what about all the people?" And then Brad Pitt, Tyler is saying, "Oh, don't worry, they're all empty. It's all our people." And I'm like, "Wait, okay, every single person that was going to be in all of those buildings is not only with you, but to the point that they're going to be willing to be part of a plot to blow them up." And so that is the justification for why actually Project Mayhem isn't killing anybody. So they're not really so bad. Like that, I think is one of the biggest issues. Like it doesn't like it sabotages the attempt to show Project Mayhem as going too far. Because by suggesting that they're going to erase the credit record, which wouldn't happen from blowing up the buildings anyway, but whatever, but without having to actually hurt anybody, it leaves room for the audience to think, oh no, that's cool, actually. And
Yeah,
I,
and that's the probably that's a great line to where I think that when you couple it with the fact that they take all the death except the dramatic, like his name was Robert Paulson,
mm-hmm,
death out of it, and that's like our hero in Edward Norton's like turning point is now somebody got hurt.
mm-hmm,
That's not a thing in the book. Like that whole garden that they build in the back,
mm-hmm,
like the reason why it's generating like these great plants and things that they can use to make their soap better
mm-hmm,
is because they're putting the Project Mayhem bodies when they bring
yeah,
them back, they're burying them in there and they're making the soil richer than it would be.
right,
And there's even a scene where he's not while he's not participating in it, he's totally understands that's what's happening
yeah,
because he's walking with Marla through the garden and he sees like these teeth from a dead body and he like pretends going to put his cigarette out or whatever, kind of pushes them into the soil so she doesn't see him.
mm-hmm,
Like that's making it very clear that our narrator understands what's going on
mm-hmm,
and they're dying. And he the scene where he gets the money from his boss in the movie, that scene exists, but what
mm-hmm,
it is he goes to all the places where he was like the projector place and the hotel, and that exact scene happens at the projector, like when the guy who runs the studio, the film, and that's where he gets the money from him. He
mm-hmm,
keeps going to work until the end, and he blows up and kills his own boss at the end of the book. Like not quite at
mm-hmm,
the end of the book, but he kills him, right? Like, and he knew he was killing him because he
right,
set the timer to blow it up when the guy got in the morning. So there's like way more of these like things that kind of they clearly removed from the movie,
yeah.
because they've changed the narrative and taken scenes that existed and they put him into the workplace so that he can leave the workplace, and that storyline goes away so they don't have to deal with this part of
Yeah. But see, like, I think that that's a perfect example of where the movie falls down for me is by choosing to take stuff like that out, it deliberately undercuts what is supposed to be, supposedly, the actual message of the movie. So they glamorize through depiction the part where everyone's just fighting and it's cool and don't you want to be a tough guy that lives in a rotting house with no electricity, like, oh no, you're some sissy that wants to live in a nice apartment with air conditioning. Like, I mean, come on. Like, at a certain point, I like there. So I understand where some of that's coming from, right? Like, it's tapping into a real thing, and it's true that we can sometimes confuse the things that are nice with nice to have with things that we need and that define us, right? Like that satire is real, and that's powerful stuff. Like that whole part of the movie is great in that regard, but it's so good in that part of the movie that when they weaken the rest, it really leaves the movie kind of thematically incoherent in the end for me. Like,
it.
obviously, like, I can agree with you. I see in there the places where they're still kind of trying to say that, but it feels like they say the first thing with their full chest and then the second thing kind of whispered into their collar.
Yeah, I agree that it definitely allows for what you were talking about. For someone who says that this is one of their 10 favorite movies and kind of forgets that part of it, it
Mm-hmm.
definitely gives you permission.
Yeah. Like
You know,
I
because the other last like really dark thing that happens that is also sort of like, again, you can tell it's been deliberately pulled from the movie. So there's the scene, like, you know, they've got this like theory like where they're going to go, anybody who's trying to shut down Fight Club, you know,
mhm,
they're going to cut their balls off, right? Like that's a
right.
thing. And so they do it with a threat, and there's like sort of the funny thing where they like snip the rubber band that they put on there off and like scare the guy or whatever.
Mhm.
In the movie, that's kind of left as like, well, that's what they do. They just scare it.
Mhm.
But the first time that it happens, that is what they do. But that is not the last time that happens.
Mhm.
And there's even a scene like, so there was an earlier scene where he had, you know, the fat in the fridge or whatever, and Marla was going in there and he was trying to stop
Mhm.
her, and he was so. But then later in the book, he's like, you know, a couple months ago, like I was worried for Marla to look in my freezer. Now I'm worried to look in my freezer because I know it's full of basically all the balls that they've taken,
Mm.
right? Like it's like definitely a thing they're doing. And there's even the part where they go after him,
Mhm.
where they're joking. They've been timing how quick they can
Why are they
cut
saving the
people.
balls in the refrigerator?
It doesn't really get into that, but it's just like they've kept them for some
Sure.
reason.
Okay.
I think it was more to like, because it doesn't ever have a scene where they actually cut someone's balls off.
Mhm.
I think it's in there because
Yeah.
it was the best way to
Well,
like show that
I
it was actually happening
I
without
feel
like.
like what the movie kind of tries to do, like as a shadow of that scene, is we see the scene where Tyler threatens the convenience store guy and takes his driver's license. And then later we see the bulletin board with a whole bunch of driver's licenses, right?
Right.
And so it feels like that it's kind of trying to serve a similar function there, although maybe the book has that thing too. But,
It briefly mentions it because it's talking about like the homework assignment thing, but it's
mm-hmm,
not as dramatic as in there. Like it sort of. I mean,
mm-hmm,
Raymond Hessler is in there. They do that thing, but it's like super short. Like it's an example of what homework assignments look
yeah,
like, not like this big scene where they like save this guy and it's like, so like look at what they're doing for
mm-hmm,
humanity. Like the movie makes it feel like, right? Like
yeah.
they just saved, you know, he's gonna have the best tasting breakfast or whatever, right? Like it's
Well,
a little
so
fluctuating,
yeah.
but
Well,
anyway.
and
But the
so
point is like they are actually doing it, and
right.
they have, and they joke about it, like they keep time of how quickly they can get somebody's balls and get out of there because they're going to try to beat their record with him. And it's
Mm-hmm,
like so when you have like those couple of things, like the death through line
mm-hmm,
and that the castration through line, and like
yeah.
this sort of, and them being sort of sociopathic about both of them, it takes a lot of the glamour out of that part
Right,
of the
yeah.
story.
What
You know.
which right, which I feel like but that's important for the story. But so I want to touch on a couple more things, but first I want to just briefly say that I will want to come around again and talk about some of the things that I think this movie is really great at. So like
Yes.
I've been kind of focusing on the stuff that I think doesn't work as well, but I do want to come around to some of the stuff that is good. But like that whole quote unquote human sacrifice part where they hold the gun on the convenience store guy and say, oh, you wanted to be a veterinarian, where I'm going to check on you in 6 weeks and you better be on your way to, like that whole thing. That Tyler's explanation of like his breakfast tomorrow morning is going to be the greatest meal ever, I think that's bullshit. That poor kid is traumatized. He's probably going to try to move because he's scared for his life, but he probably doesn't have any money to move. And how is that? I feel like that sort of fear is not the way you actually motivate people to follow their dreams. What it does is it ties up their dream with trauma and fear of death.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that the psychology of the whole point of that I feel like is just completely wrong. And again, it's not necessarily that the movie is meant, like, I feel like even as depicted in the movie, I feel like in that scene the movie is on Tyler's side, like it believes what he is saying. Not necessarily that you should go out and do that, but it believes that this will actually have a positive effect on this kid's life.
Right.
And I don't agree. um, so like that's just an example of one where I feel like the movie, I don't know that it's coherent in what it's trying to say. But um, there was one oh so the one other thing I wanted to circle back around to, this is what I kind of started on at the beginning, was this idea that so I saw in the trivia that the author had said that the movie was partly inspired by a time that he got beat up in an sort of an unrelated incident, but then what he was surprised by is when he went into work,
Yeah,
nobody asked him about it. They
that's in the
acted like it was
afterword
normal,
here.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
and so I believe that that could happen. But I would also say that, like, as depicted in the movie, people don't ask him about it because they are already terrified of an obviously disturbed dude. Like, and I think to a large extent, the character as depicted in the movie is at least as at fault as society is, because he is not making any effort to engage with people. Now, to some extent, he has difficulty with that, right? Like, that is why he only finds that he's able to do it when he goes to these support group meetings, right? And to some extent, we could say it's probably not a particularly moral choice to lie about needing to be in part of as part of those support group meetings, but at the very least it is an attempt to seek out some kind of a community where emotion is expressed, right? Like, so you can see that there's like some effort being made in that direction, and although it's probably not targeted in an ideal way because it involves deception, um, but at the same time, you could almost see that eventually leading to a better outcome for this character, right? Like, eventually someone who runs one of these groups is going to figure out what's going on and start trying to talk to him and say, so, like, why are you coming here? You know, like, it doesn't have to be we're chasing you off because you're lying. It can be clearly you're here because you're getting something out of this. Let's talk about that, right? But
So
but
I know. Yeah. Oh, anyway, go ahead.
but
Yeah.
to just to take it back to sort of the office environment sort of thing, this idea that, white collar corporate culture is just mindless drones who never interact. It's like, well, it is if you treat it that way. You know what I mean? It's like, I have coworkers who I have actual conversations with, and it's generally it's a filtered version of yourself. You don't necessarily get into the deep personal things, but that doesn't mean that there isn't genuine camaraderie there, right? Like, you get out of those things what you put into them.
Yes. There are definitely people at my work that if they showed up with a black eye, I would be, bro, what happened, and actually want to know.
Yeah.
Like, what's going on in your life that this happened to you? Like, and I want to know as much as they were willing to share the honest answer. I mean, again, it's
Hmm.
but
Yeah. So
anyway.
anyway, so like I think one of the things that I found surprising when I watched it this time is, aside from the fact that the movie definitely presents this insurance company he works at as not particularly good for the community, like specifically working for big corporations to help them avoid having to pay out settlements and stuff like that. So, like, that's not great. But other than that piece of it, it's kind of remarkable to me how much his boss comes across as pretty freaking reasonable under the circumstances.
So I hate to keep doing this, but it's just so fresh on my
No,
mind.
no,
And
no.
like
Absolutely,
this,
I'm
like
interested.
in the book, he has all the same interactions with his boss, save the one where he beats himself up in his office. Like,
Uh
that
huh.
scene doesn't exist because he never quits. He repeatedly like talks about how much he likes his boss,
Mm-hmm.
even though like he he feels like guilty when he goes through the whole thing about like threatening to like come in with a, when the guy finds a thing on the thing, and he basically threatens to come in with a gun and shoot everybody if he doesn't leave him alone.
Mm-hmm.
But he has like these funny interactions with him. Like, so in the book, like he spends most of the book with like a holy bit in his cheek. Like, he's not glamorous. Like, he's
Mm-hmm.
not look like Edward Norton. And his boss came and says like, and he finally says something to him. He's like, "What are you going to do about that?" And he goes, "Well, when I drink my coffee, I hold my fingers so the coffee doesn't come out." And his boss is just like, it's not what I meant, but yeah.
Uh, well,
He has a general good
yeah.
relationship with him, and he's generally genuinely sad when he realizes that himself as Tyler blew him up and killed
Mm-hmm.
his own boss. but Tyler was trying to do it to free him because that was the one thing he wouldn't leave
Right.
behind
Yeah.
was his job because he liked his boss and which is that like so it leaves this weird thing of yes, is trying to say this thing about the corporate culture, but like that's the one place he goes that he actually likes people, but he doesn't connect with them
Mm-hmm.
exactly. But he's got a purpose, right? Like even though it's a bad purpose, like he doesn't agree with what he's doing, but he does it and he does a good job with it, which is why he stays employed, even though he comes in looking like that. And so that's like it's a whole like odd relationship. And then to
Mm-hmm.
kind of take that a step further, the I know they talk about it in the movie, and like Tyler makes the joke and like slaps him on the head, so like the first monkey shot into space, and they call him
Mm-hmm.
like we're all a bunch of space monkeys. That's like a big descriptor of them in the space, and what they describe space monkeys as like space monkey is something that can do a complicated task if you break it down into a simple thing.
Mm-hmm.
Pull this lever, press this button, and then all the other things are happening. And so that's what they've trained these guys to do. You don't know anything. You do your task and you do
Mm-hmm.
that, and then he'll do his task and he'll do his task, and we build this whole Project Mayhem out of all of this
Mm-hmm.
stuff. So they are actually the mindless drones when it
Mm-hmm.
comes down to it because they can only pull the lever, press the button. It goes into that analogy so many times,
Right. Yeah.
and it's very clear that like being a disciple of Tyler's is not glamorous, right? And so it's another one of those places where I think there's a disconnect in what the movie does
Yeah.
because it doesn't hone in on that point of this is actually the same thing. Like I told you, it builds these dichotomies in the book
Mm-hmm.
of the tribalism of consumerism and wanting to look like everybody else and
Yeah.
impress other people and what they're trying to do to each other in Fight
Which
Club
is
is literally
everybody
the
has
same
to shave
thing.
their heads and dress the same, and you don't know
Yep.
what you're actually working on.
Yeah, and they're homogenizing them there. They're seeking a tribe there. They're
Mm-hmm.
doing all the same things. They're just doing it in a bleak way
Yeah.
to this end that Tyler and the narrator have cooked up
Right.
that nobody else believes in this vision. They just believe in the charisma of them.
Mm-hmm.
Like no one else knows what they're actually trying to do. And it's literally like they've built their own little corporation that's just happened to be hell bent on destruction.
Yeah. So,
you know?
question, because this was my pet peeve with this movie all the way back to when I first saw it in the theater.
I feel
How
like I
does
know
the
what's coming.
huh? Uh,
I feel like I know what question's coming, but go ahead.
how does the book handle the actual final killing of Tyler Durden?
It's much more clear in the book that it has to do with intent.
Right.
He fully intended to kill himself. So what he had done, like it makes more sense because he had that cut in his cheek,
Mm-hmm.
and what he does at the end, he tries to kill himself by going to Fight Club and fighting everyone. He signs up for 50 fights, and he just
Mm-hmm.
wants to get beaten to death, right? And so it ends up like opening his entire cheek like this, so
Ugh.
that when Tyler or himself is holding the gun in, it has to point this direction because
Okay.
it would fall out of his mouth. And so he's got it in like
Okay.
kind of the other way. So
Oh,
he intends to kill
he
himself, but
blows
because
out
he's
the
got
other
point,
cheek.
blows out his other cheek,
Mm-hmm.
and then he believes that he is dead. And there's because again, when you have a narrator, it's a little different, and you don't have
Right.
to have the big bomb scene because it doesn't end with the buildings blowing up. Like that's not a thing. And
Mm.
in fact, they actually don't blow up because they used the wrong thing or what.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna get all of it, but no, the buildings don't blow up, and they weren't trying to erase a credit report. It was just another part of their destruction. It just happened to
Mm-hmm.
be when he was fed up with everything. So he intends, and so he talks about how he's in heaven and he's gonna wait there, and it's like that's when he realizes he really does love Marla because he can't wait till she gets there, and then he sort of like realizes that he's not, and that he's in a hospital room,
Mm-hmm.
and he's like, but then the end of the book is all the hospital like orderlies and stuff are like come up to him and they're like, just like you said, Mr. Durden, everything is going to plan.
Mm-hmm.
That's like the end of the book. So it's very dark there too.
Makes me think of
But yeah,
Clockwork Orange a little bit.
yeah. So it's not even clear that Tyler's actually dead. It's that he, but he does, he does think he killed himself. He
Right.
believes that he did. That eradicated it for the time being, but you can tell that there's
Mm-hmm.
still like it didn't make everything go
Yeah.
away.
Yeah, and I can see how that would be hard to. I don't know how you would show that better than this movie does, but at the
It,
same
it,
time,
it would take the theme away because there's like a part where he like thinks he's talking to angels and stuff. Like it would
yeah.
the tone when it's written in his voice, which has a very like steady, when your whole story is told to you in one voice, like the weird shit like that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
break. But in
Yeah.
how the movie's done, if you had like put him in heaven and he's talking to angels and then he's not in heaven and then Marla's there and it's like
Yeah.
it's hard to do that, right?
Well, and so
Especially when you
but
want the dramatic like Tyler's,
right.
which that's I think where the movie's failing is it shows that Tyler back of Tyler's head gets
Yes.
blown out.
Yes. Well, and he's sitting there conscious, aware, watching Tyler fall down with a hole in a different spot.
Right.
And it's like that like so like I feel like I can squint and say, "Okay, I get what they're doing, but I don't like how it was shown. No, I don't like how it was depicted." But the more we've talked about the things that they changed from the book, though, the more it makes me feel like the changes feel consistently deliberate in a way of glamorizing what's going on and not selling the part of how it's actually bad.
Which is honestly for me too, because until I started saying them out loud in this conversation, like I knew we were going to talk about that, but that's why I keep bringing the book up like
Oh
more than
sure,
I
no,
actually
I mean
want to.
I'm glad you read it and reread it because I think it's been really interesting to talk about in this context.
Yeah, and it's just like, oh wait, oh yeah, that thing. That's right, the thing that because you have a more clean thing of like what bothers you. Again, we'll get
Mm-hmm.
to the things we liked about the movie, but what
Yeah.
bothers you about the movie. And now I have like the the well
Mm-hmm.
actually like there is an explanation for that. Honestly, the only thing that's really confusing in the book is the scene, and it's not told the exact same way, but I don't need to go into the exact differences. But when they actually get him, and they're going to castrate him,
Mm-hmm.
because now he's and they were talking about, oh, how great of you to show that you said that if anybody messed with Project Mayhem, even you, we should do it.
Mm-hmm.
And you said you'd say that. No, you said, when he's like, no, I'm Tyler Durden and I changed the rules. And like, you definitely said you'd say that.
Yeah.
That all that happens, and then they put the ether on his mouth and he passes out, and like he thinks he's done.
Mm-hmm.
And then he wakes up in his old condo and he's fully intact, I guess is the best way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really confusing at the time being, like why they didn't do it, but what it you sort of glean, and this is the one thing it didn't actually be very clear on, but you can kind of pull it out, is that it was all part of this like grander plan that like he had actually thought through like all these scenarios, and like
Mm-hmm.
it was to scare him and to kind of like this, and like but he had like taught them
Well,
to do that to him,
well,
so it's
and
weird,
we could
as opposed to him
envision.
escaping, right?
Well, see, because the thing is too that like what is clear once the reveal happens is that while the narrator did not know he was actually Tyler Durden, the personality, definitely knows what's going on, right?
Yes.
And so we could imagine that there would be moves from Tyler designed to counter the narrator beyond the idea of I'm going to have them cut our mutual balls off, right?
Correct.
Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
uh,
So well, it never explicitly says that you definitely get that, but that's
mhm,
probably the most confusing part, because literally like you're waiting for it to happen, because what happens after that is that he has this like weird moment of clarity where it sort of happens stylistically in the movie, but it's like where he finally doesn't just realize that he's Tyler, but their memories like merge,
mhm.
and now he knows
Well,
all the things that he did.
kind of like the
Yeah.
scene in the hotel room, right, in the movie.
Yeah, so that scene happens, but the memories don't merge there. He just understands what's going on,
Yeah, that's
and then
that's
they
where we
keep going
see
on.
that we see the callbacks to previous scenes where it's obvious that it's actually only Edward Norton there.
Right. So in the
Um,
book, he knows that he was there, and he like talks about how he was the one doing those, but it hasn't crystallized for him yet.
mm-hmm.
And then it's later on that happens, and he starts talking back, because he actually goes and he ends up killing this guy or whatever. It's again not all the details need to be. I'm trying to talk about things that are specifically related
Sure,
to this
sure, sure.
conversation. But when that memory crystallizes, you're expecting that what happened there and why that happened to like actually be revealed also, and it doesn't, and so it kind of leaves you feeling like what exactly happened, but you can pull it out.
Mm-hmm.
um so it's I mean it's a good book. I mean, it's dark as shit,
Sure,
like
yeah.
it's
Um,
and it leaves you with a different feeling, right? Because the cool lines are still cool. in the
Mm-hmm.
book. Like the things that are like the glamorous, like takeaways, like the quotes that are on coffee cups and like all that
Mm-hmm.
stuff. All those are in the book, and they all feel awesome when you read them in the book.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not. It's almost like they took, and there were even some that happened later in the book. It's almost like they took everything cool. Again, like we're talking about, like they really there is a deliberation in this movie
Mm-hmm.
to take all the cool stuff and move it to the front. So there's things that he says and does that are cool, and later in, even when things are really dark, that so in the book there's like way more of a constant tension of like this is
Mm-hmm.
cool, actually is it not really, and then it starts to tilt to wait, this is way less cool. you
Mm-hmm.
know and then like the parts where it is like a cool like expression or saying that kind of taps into something, like you almost feel like weird liking at that point
Mm-hmm.
because you're like down this other line, right?
Yeah.
And then that sort of ebb and flow is like actually really cool.
All right. Well, speaking of really cool, one
Yes,
of
let's
the
get to the
things,
really cool
yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
So one of the things that this movie does exceptionally well is that whole reveal of him actually being Tyler Durden all along, and that whole bit, because it's one of those things, kind of like when you rewatch The Sixth Sense, knowing the secret, right? It's the whole thing where when you watch it, knowing the truth, there are so many signs that you just explain some other way in your head when you don't know, because it why would you ever guess that they're not the same like that they're one person, right? But there's just so
Well,
many places, like every line that's confusing and frustrating from Marla, when we don't know, makes perfect sense when we do. And all of these sorts of things, like there's so many scenes like they're on the bus together and a guy shoves past Tyler and says nothing, but then pushes past Ed Norton and says, "Excuse me." And stuff, just little stuff like that. The movie is just so good at running interference on that, which is not a trivially easy thing to do in a movie where everything's so inherently visual, right? It's one thing in a book where, especially if we're so in inhabiting the narrator's mind, even past the idea of being in the scene that they're describing, right? Then it's totally in their perception. But movies, to some extent, have to kind of show the reality, or else what are we doing? So, but the way that it manages that, I think, is really exceptional.
yes, I think it's great. The just to that point in the book, I can't speak for sure, but I feel like if I read the book first, I think I would have figured it out earlier. Honestly, like it drops way more hints,
Mm-hmm.
but they are through the like they're. But again, I can't say for sure because I've read the book since I knew what was going on.
Right.
But there's a lot more of like the lines like I know this because Tyler knows this, like
Mm-hmm.
before he knows he's Tyler, and
Yeah.
there's the like why are Tyler's words coming out of my mouth, and why do he's like this feels weird, this feels like Tyler, like
Mm-hmm.
there's like way more things that he's struggling with, like these strange interactions where he's like something's not right here, and then but he kind of moves on, and I just feel like again I feel like it's dropping those hints that you could pick up, but I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. Again, the movie is phenomenal at that,
Yeah. Yeah. There's just so
and
many parts where, I mean, obviously, the
and
performances.
depicting them as two very different people. Like
Yeah.
obviously Brad Pitt and Ed Norton, like to pick two incredibly talented actors who have incredibly different, who are both charismatic, which is
Mm-hmm.
important because you have to believe that the narrator is charismatic also because he has
Mm-hmm.
to be Tyler, right? But they're charismatic in very different ways and they look very different, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like the performances, the way it's staged, the writing of it, and the filmmaking of it, like all of that is just top notch stuff there. And also, like, we kind of talked about this before, that like even when I'm criticizing the second half of the movie, it's specifically in the context of how good the first half is, when it's doing the part where we're selling the glamour of this thing and why people would be drawn to this sort of thing. They're looking for community, but it's community that makes them feel badass and cool and part of something bigger, like that sort of thing, right? It's it and just it's a little bit like, there's the idea, the question of like, can you make an anti-war movie because it's inherently glamorizing? But it is like when we're doing that part, like the fighting parts are made to look cool, like even to the point where, if we wanted to look at it critically again, we could just say like it is absolutely glamorizing the fights beyond like realism, right?
Oh
Because
yeah.
real fights in a parking lot with no protective gear or anything, people get permanent injuries and die in fights like that all the time. It's not like it doesn't take that much, really. Like, just the idea that someone can tap out doesn't change the fact that if you flip someone over and they land on their head, they might just be dead. Um, and so, but the movie makes it seem like, other than getting a black eye or something, it's all ultimately just for fun, you
Yeah.
know? Which again, I don't want to make this critical again. What I'm saying is it is doing that on purpose and it's doing it extremely well.
Yeah,
Um,
I think the scene when they start Fight Club, or before they start Fight Club, when they just start, when their first fight
mm-hmm.
is one of the most powerful scenes in like movie history.
Yeah,
Like when
it's
they're having the
exhilarating. Yeah.
yeah, the whole discussion, like they're drinking the pitchers, and there's just the flippant line of like, "Hey man, are you gonna ask? Just ask. You didn't come here just to get 3 pitchers of beer from me. Like you need a place to stay."
Mm-hmm.
And like just that whole, like they're building this, like this camaraderie with each other,
Yeah.
like before you know any of what's going on. And even when it's like this weird thing of like how he's like,
Mm-hmm.
how he built this persona that he can have this bro camaraderie with. It's like, and then to going out there and like the whole just, I want you to hit me as hard as you can. And
Mm-hmm.
the like, and the sort of like, what are you talking about? And then the just deadpan music goes silent. I want you to
Mm-hmm.
hit me as hard as you can. And then he throws the worst punch in history.
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
it just cuts the tension too. And then it like dials up into this, like they're fighting, and then they're drinking beers together, and they're like, this is amazing, like what did we just discovered something. Like that whole thing is
Mm-hmm.
iconic,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so it's done exceptionally well, like to a fault in some respects, but in a way that like it's obvious that that is the intent of those portions of the movie, and they do it extremely well. So like it is impossible to fault the filmmaking of those parts of the movie because it's so obviously accomplishing the what they set out to do, and it's thrilling. It really is. I mean, even I, who generally disapprove of the message of the movie, as in the end, find it exciting to watch those parts because it's that good at doing that part, and and it's true also that like all of the stuff like the satire about the catalog and what coffee table defines you as a person and that sort of thing. And one line that always kind of stood out to me is when they're having that first conversation on the plane, and he's like, "You're the most interesting single serving friend I've ever had." It's like, "Oh, I get it. It's very clever. How's that working out for you?" "What do you mean?" "Being clever."
being clever. Yeah.
And it's the sort of thing where it's one thing to say, being able to sort of politely make little jokes to someone as social lubricant when you're in a stressful situation like being forced next to each other on a plane, like that's not a bad thing. But it's also, it could be understanding the difference between that behavior and who you are as a person, right? Like, are the idea of, are you defining yourself by being of as someone who makes clever little jokes? Like, is that who you think of yourself as a person? Like that sort of thing. And
Well,
that,
especially once when you're rewatching it and the reality of it, like he's talking to himself,
yeah.
and he's actually questioning himself, like, how is this working out for you? Like
I
you think you're clever, but is
Right.
that like,
I am.
yeah.
What I imagine is that that is where the Tyler persona, in the movie at least, that is where the Tyler persona is being invented. Like he's been having these things subconsciously all along, all of these thoughts and feelings, but that is where he is specifically inventing. I don't feel comfortable even allowing myself to think these thoughts. So who is the person who can?
Yeah.
and he's inventing the persona of Tyler Durden in that conversation. Is the way I think of it in the movie, anyway.
Yeah, I mean that line is in the book. Like I said, all the best lines are in the
Mm-hmm.
book. Like they're lifted straight from Chuck Palahniuk. Like, but it's not again, and then this one isn't as enough to get. There's not enough. There's nuances to
Mm-hmm.
how that part, like how he invents Tyler and stuff that aren't necessary to the conversation. They're just
Mm-hmm.
it's just like, hey, this was in the book and it wasn't. It's not as much dramatic as some of the other stuff we talked
Yeah.
about. So, um, but yeah, that scene is really good. Like the way it depicts his insomnia
Mm-hmm.
is like again like he talks about it in the book, but like to then the copy of a copy of a copy, like all those lines are those are all in the book. But
Mm-hmm.
when there's a visual to accompany that powerful line, where it's got like the flickering and there's like a Tyler flickering in
Mm-hmm.
and like some people flicker in and out, like it looks like he's in a copy machine when he's like
Yeah.
riding through the airport, like that's incredibly powerful.
Mm-hmm.
um, and so these are some of the scenes where I was like, hey, these exist in like two different mediums, but one does one better. Like that, like yes, all that's in here, but that does not deliver on
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
level. The other scene that is really like there's a dark comedy scene in the movie when they have the homework assignment to go start a fight with somebody who doesn't want to be in a fight.
Right.
And it's like hilarious because it's like it's in the book too. Like the whole thing, people don't want to get into fights with you,
Right.
right? But it sort of leaves it at that in the book. But then the movie actually shows like how difficult it is to get someone to actually fight you in
Right.
just regular society, and it's
Mm-hmm.
like it's kind of like darkly funny,
Yeah. Well.
and it's got that kind of like
Yeah.
weird music soundtrack
Yeah.
and like the priest where he's like
Like.
spraying the priest with
Yeah.
water, like
Like that sequence that sequence is definitely funny, and but like, and it also just kind of like this is not making it critical about the movie again, but just really thinking about like the function of that scene, right? This is again where in the in the book version or even in the movie version, like I think what we would hope people take away from that is it's allowed to be funny, absolutely, because what they're doing is provoking society in a way that's unexpected and produces unexpected results. But it's also like the fact that it's so hard to get people to join in the fight, like it's because most people actually don't want to fight. It's not so it's one thing to say you feel like fighting and being in part of in this fight club where you get to fight the way you want to is good for you, but to force that on someone who doesn't want it, like that's but I mean I think the like the inherent psychology of it is presented as this homework assignment is trying to persuade them everybody else actually also wants it, they just don't know it, and you're going to
right.
force them to discover that within themselves. But it's again it's kind of like this whole idea of part of making all of these space monkeys behave the way you want them to behave is by persuading them that everyone else is also the same. You know,
Yeah,
you know,
there's a homogeny to what
they
they're trying
only
to do.
act different than you because they don't know the truth yet like you do. And you're going to help them find out, even though really what we're talking about is unprovoked assault on perfect strangers.
Yeah, and I did like I was curious if it was on purpose because it's it's not overt in the book other than like I think I told you like there's some things about like just their relationship with like wanting God to notice them and stuff like that. Like it's not
Mm-hmm.
an overt religious thing. It's more of
Mm-hmm.
like this is a like it's and it's still some of it ties to like acting up for your dad to notice you and how your dad is your model for God
Yeah.
and like that kind of stuff. Like there's a lot of that, but whether the fact that they put a preacher in that scene is sort of like a hat tip to like the
Mm-hmm.
fact that like that's part of like there is a very subtle, it's not a knock because it definitely doesn't knock religion by any means. It's not
Mm-hmm.
critical of religion by any
Well,
means, but there is sort of the done the wrong way kind
mm-hmm.
of thing
Yeah.
with religion, that's what these guys are, religion. Like they have a cult leader
Mm-hmm.
who is promising them something that they are then enlightened, and other
Mm-hmm.
people need to
Mm-hmm.
be enlightened and become disciples too. Like they refer to them as his
Yeah.
disciples all the time.
Uh-huh.
You know,
It's a hundred
you know,
percent a cult. Yeah. I
yeah,
mean, it's exactly a cult. It's like, but one of the things that the movie does, though, again, to kind of make okay what they're doing is having the priest from that sequence later be shown in a fight with the guy who's spraying him at the fight club and having like loved the experience. So the movie tells us that the homework assignment was right because he really did want it after all.
I forgot about that scene, honestly. Yeah, you're right.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think the movie does include in this whole vein is beating up Jared Leto. You know, I wanted to destroy something beautiful, right?
Yeah,
And
awesome.
I think that is the part in the movie where it's really hard to defend the narrator's actions in that moment, even if you're on the pro Fight Club side, right?
Yeah.
It because it breaks the rules, right? It's again he's not following the rules that they have set down for themselves. Even though obviously the rules are capricious and arbitrary anyway, right? Because the whole thing, the whole gag about rule 1 you don't about Fight Club, rule 2 you don't talk about Fight Club, it's obviously bullshit. Because the whole thing is to grow this big community.
Yes.
The whole point of those two rules is to make it feel secret and subversive and naughty when you do tell people about it, right? Like that's so the
I'm not
rule.
supposed to tell you. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but I'm bringing you in on this cool secret. But again, like when he does that, and it's so obviously like even everybody else there is saying, "Whoa, what is this? I don't understand because this is not the model of the behavior that we've been talking about." And that's the first time I think in the movie where it does actually kind of bring us back down to grounded realism a little bit. You know, like, oh, you know what? It turns out actually you can really hurt someone like this. But then and then when we discover that character, while still looking extremely messed up but healing, is still back in and 100% in on the program. That is one of the points where I feel like the movie is putting some marks in that column of like, whoa, wait a minute, something like I did that to this guy and he's still on board. What is happening here?
Yes. And so, again, as we're sort of talking through it out loud, it's interesting because that is one of those kind of scenes that later in the movie it's kind of removed some of the darker scenes.
Mm-hmm.
That's one that is beat for beat what's in the book that they didn't pull.
Mm-hmm.
And it's weird. It's interesting that that's the one that we both feel is like that's probably one of the darkest scenes in the movie. But in the book, that's the turning point to where it gets like really dark, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like no, now this is what's actually
Mm-hmm.
now we've reset what Fight Club is, and this is how everybody fights.
Yeah.
Like that part, they kind of take that part out too.
Mm.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, they sort of because they put the guy in like the neck brace, like they're trying to hint at it, but
Mm-hmm.
it, there becomes parts where like
Yeah.
a dude loses his tongue because he bites it off. Like there's some like nasty, nasty parts now that I'm
Right.
thinking about it in the
Mm-hmm.
book where it's like, no, once that happens and Tyler essentially takes it too far, then everybody starts taking it too far. Especially
Mm-hmm.
since the guy came back, they're like, oh,
Right. Yeah.
this is like a whole new level of enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah. So I think so. Like so, I think there are places where you can see that the movie is not entirely ignoring that part of the message, right? Like, and so like even though I feel like the movie definitely soft pedals that element of the story by and large, there's places there where it's there. And then I think also it's interesting like the character of Marla in some ways is another part of all of that, right? Because part of what is selling Edward Norton's character to actively resist is his fear for her safety, right? because he's worried they're going to hurt or kill her because she knows too much, right? And that's part of what he is like triggering his active resistance towards the end.
So in in the book, that is like his sole motivation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because he's not a good person, right? Like, he's equally complicit in all of this stuff. He just didn't realize at what level.
Mm-hmm.
And because he's in love with Marla, that's part of why he's like rethinking what he wants this to be. And he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't know what he wants out of it. He doesn't know, like, it's a very complicated love story because it's all in his head. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and obviously she has dialogue in it, but like his reconciliation of like how he actually feels about her and like all that type of stuff is like a big portion of like his end game of like why he's trying to get out and why he doesn't want to do this anymore. And then the killing of his boss is kind of like the final straw of like, no, 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 this is too far.
Mm-hmm.
Like the things that I do like, Marla, I like my job, I like my boss, like now those things are all gone. And
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about like, oh, now I'm hitting rock bottom. Like, no, I don't want that. Like, and how do I get out of this? And then his way out is he tries to kill himself by getting beat the shit out of in fights, but it's
Mm-hmm.
which is also a weird dark scene that they don't put in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but so I see why they put that in there because that is like a big thing, and like she's in love with him too, and
Mm-hmm.
he makes one last attempt to go to like the one of those groups,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what he realizes when he goes back, like they all remember him, like they welcome him back, like he's
Mm-hmm.
got this whole community there,
Yeah.
and Marla's there, but she doesn't want him there because that was right after he killed the guy that I kind of talked about before, and so they get in this huge fight there. They both like expose each other's secrets, and to your point, the group there, rather than like shun them,
Mm-hmm.
is like, wait, what's going on? Like what is bringing you here? That like you're
Mm-hmm.
people that we enjoy, we like, and you share. Like what's going on that like this that you're here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then he runs off, and then like later, what ends up happening, like she brings like friends of theirs from the group to like try to like talk him when they find because she finds him like
Mm-hmm.
ready to kill himself as Tyler or with Tyler to kill Tyler with through himself, and they're trying to talk him out of it. Like so,
Mm-hmm.
it's like there's actually like this lean into like the love story that they have, the actual community you can build through just genuinely connecting with people, even if you're
Yeah.
lying to them,
Right.
like yeah.
Yeah.
And so
Like.
that's like a whole weird thing that again I didn't pick much up on it because it's sort of subtle, but now that we're talking about it,
Mm-hmm.
which again is why I ended up talking about the book way more than I thought because like I just read the book and I enjoyed it, and then now that we're speaking about it, I'm like realizing like there's some things in here that are actually really interesting in
Mm-hmm.
how they differ from that, and
Well.
how they lead some. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, like, what's very clear about this movie and how it's been so enduring, even if it's often enduring with people who seem to be taking perhaps some of the wrong lessons from it. It is tapping into a real feeling that I think a lot of people have from time to time, if not all the time, of feeling alienated from other people, angry, afraid, and they don't know what to do about it. Right? Like that's a real problem with real people in the real world. And this movie gets that in a real way, right? And I think the issue is that it can, like, that problem can be, like, is a question that has multiple answers and not all of them are constructive answers, right? And so I think sometimes people can take some of the wrong um, lessons from either movies like this or just from the internet or whatever it is, right? And that's where you get, people who have, rage problems and that sort of thing. Like, it's not obviously a simple one for one sort of thing, but it does, like, there's a real phenomenon that matters to real world people that this movie is observing and trying to do something with. And I think it's maybe not altogether successful, but it's trying to do something. And I think that that, is worthy of discussion, but I think it's also potentially worthy of discussion of saying maybe we need to look for stories that do present a perhaps more constructive outlet or way for some of these feelings to be addressed. Because I think in a lot of senses, it is kind of that sense of community that's what people feel missing. But sometimes what can happen is you end up with a sense of community that perhaps because you have lied to get into it, like with the narrator character in the support groups, where he feels like he can't let that be real enough to solve his problems because he has introduced into it an artificial limitation that prohibits him from engaging all the way.
Right, which is why when Marla shows up, like the very specific line he says is her lie reflects my lie, which
Mm-hmm.
means I can't disassociate anymore.
Right. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. So the thing is, it's like, has that character not considered going to insomnia support groups that really exist for the problems that he actually has so that he wouldn't need to be lying and he could find genuine sincere community there? I think in the case of this particular character, he deliberately doesn't do that because he wants that feeling of safety. The lie lets him feel like he doesn't have to really expose where he's actually vulnerable, right? He's got a safety on.
I, I'm going to say it again, but so in the book, there
Okay.
there is a explanation for that a little bit
Mm-hmm.
that takes it a little further. Like they hint at it, like in the whole, like with the line, which again is in the book of, when people think you're dying, they really listen to you instead of waiting for their turn to talk.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a memory that he has when he was a teenager and he was poor and he had to get a wart removed. So he went to the medical school because that's the only place he could get it done. And they noticed something on his foot that they thought was this like new, like the flesh eating virus or something.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody got like so, like they were all excited. They were like, oh my gosh, like how long have you had that? Like, oh, and everybody was paying attention to him. And it was like, it was just his birthmark.
Mm-hmm.
And he like talks about how he kept a picture of, like, he keeps a picture of that birthmark, even though he still has it. Like he keeps it on his mirror because it reminds him of the time that people thought he was dying for 10 minutes and how much attention they paid to him.
Mm-hmm.
So like again, something that doesn't really fit in the movie, but like it gives him that motivation of like
Right.
why he's going to these specific, like he's going to deadly like
Right. Yeah.
groups. Like he's not going to Alcoholics Anonymous. Like he's
Mm-hmm.
going to places where people are dying because
Right.
that's, he wants to feel that feeling
Yeah.
of when people think you're dying.
There's
Yeah.
probably also a dark, cynical element to it that's kind of in the bad at the back of mind is that um, you don't have to actually know any individual person for that long because they might actually just die. So like
Yeah.
you don't have it's like what the end result of the relationship is going to be.
Right. And then there's the flip side of it is how disappointed, like how, well, not disappointed, but like how, yeah, how disappointed, not him, but how disappointed the medical students and the doctors were
Right.
when it wasn't this like new flesh eating virus they thought they were going to have a case of, that he
Right.
was just a guy with a birthmark getting a wart removed, and how it just like,
Mm-hmm.
they all left and it was just like one
Made
kid who
him
just like,
feel like he had let them down somehow.
yeah. And
Yeah.
well, and he kind of did. Like that was like the weirdest part about it, is like they actually felt let down that he
Mm-hmm.
wasn't dying.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that was like a weird like feeling for him, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then he was left alone in the room, like sitting on, like, and where it was, he had to be naked, so he's just naked with this medical student who just freeze dries his ward off and then sends him on his way. And it was like so anticlimactic to like
Mm-hmm.
what they were building to, and then like left him with this weird feeling to the point that he was still thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it like, but again, that's why it's like when it taps into all these
Yeah.
things of like these weird memories that you have, like things could, some innocuous thing can happen to you
Yeah.
somewhere in your life that like,
Mm-hmm.
runs through, and not that it makes you schizophrenic and all that, but it's like,
Right.
they're, it's told in a hyperbolic way of
Right.
like how all these things matter, right?
Well, yeah, and so I think that like we definitely don't want to ever oversimplify like the psychology of some of these sorts of things, because people are complex and people are different. You know, there's commonalities in some things, but not, you know, it's nothing's universal. But I think it's also true that in some respects, like things like therapy or sincere support groups can be really helpful for some people who are dealing with some of these sorts of feelings. Um, but in a lot of respects, like I don't want to put this on the movie because the movie does show ultimately that it's, you know, it's a bad thing, even if it's kind of, we've talked about that element of it, but just the idea that there are a lot of people who resist those options because society or media or their friends or whatever have made them feel that that would make them weak somehow to do that. And so, you know, it's a complicated problem that there's not an easy solution for. But boy, we talked about Fight Club a lot. I mean, not that I doubted that we would, but
Yeah, that's where I was just kind of I was just thinking about that too. Like we just spent over an hour and a half,
yeah,
or just an hour and a half on Fight Club,
sure.
and
Not quite an
so
hour and a half, but almost. So, oh, sorry, did you?
well, that's what I was gonna say is like, do we want to try to do these other ones? I mean, I need to do them really quick
Oh,
because like,
sure. Yeah,
or do we want to do it, or
I
we'd
don't.
rather do a part two?
Well, let's go ahead and do them. I don't think that we necessarily will have nearly as much to say as we just did with Fight Club, because Fight Club has this whole huge thematic element that is complicated in all the ways that we just discussed. And I think that that's, you know, Panic Room and Zodiac are interesting movies to discuss, but they're not necessarily going to be complex or controversial in the same ways. So let's go ahead and check in. Well, so first of all, just this, like from his career, even after Fight Club, he has a couple more music videos, but he's definitely shifting more into feature uh, range. And so in 2002
I'm gonna
comes,
fill my water while you're
okay,
going through that.
yeah,
Yeah.
comes Panic Room, which is stars Jodie Foster and Forrest Whitaker and little baby Kristen Stewart, who is 12 years old in this movie, and it's kind of amazing. She's actually pretty good. Like, Kristen Stewart is an interesting actress because, of course, she did a couple of things like this when she was a kid and a child actress. And then she was cast in the Twilight movies, and that just became who she was for a whole lot of people for several years. And now that those are done, she's actually kind of come back around again to people saying, oh, yeah, actually, she's pretty good. At least that's certainly my impression of her career.
Also,
Um,
my impression, yes.
yeah. But it's actually, I think, pretty. It was exciting to me for one, putting this movie on. I had entirely forgotten that she was the daughter in this, but she's pretty good. I think she's great in this role. She's got a lot of different things that she needs to do, but I think she sells all the different emotions she needs to go through while still very much conveying she's a kid. Like one of the scenes that really kind of stood out to me was the bit early on where they've just moved into this place, and they've got pizza, and Jodie Foster's feeling like, I wanted our first night to be like special. I should have gotten something other than pizza. And you know, the kid is saying, I like pizza. Like that's like you already succeeded as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Pizza, I wouldn't have wanted something fancy. I like pizza. And, you know, but like, and it's just a moment where it's authentic. Like, we believe she means it, but it's also a kid sensing anxiety in her mom and wanting to try to soothe it, you know? And like, it's a nice little scene. But in any case, like, I kind of jumped onto Kristen Stewart because I think it's interesting seeing her in this. But the movie is basically a thriller where Jodie Foster and her daughter move into this house that has a panic room, which the movie at the time that it came out, they had to explain what panic rooms were, but I think it's a much more commonly understood phenomenon now. But so they're staying at the house, but it turns out they've just moved in, and there's actually a floor safe that nobody had known about from the previous owner. And so these criminals, including the son, question mark, of the guy who used to live there,
it's like an estranged son who,
They call
so
him
he know,
Junior, but it's not.
yeah, so he knows he's not going to get the fair share of the inheritance, so
Hmm.
that's why
Right.
he's enlisted these
He
criminals because he's going to steal the whole thing.
right. Well, so what he knows is there is a safe that had money that was not on the other like reported stuff. Like nobody knows it's there.
Oh yeah, that's right, yeah.
That's what his logic anyway, though. Although as we get to know that character, we can certainly question whether he's right about that. It's
Right.
certainly true that they went ahead and sold the house without doing anything about it, so it's probable that few people, if any, knew that it was there. But it also just seems like, especially by the time there's a reveal, it's $22 million worth of bank bonds. It seems unlikely that nobody else knew it was there. I mean, $22 million.
Yeah, that's the thing with this movie. Like, there's a lot of machinations in it
Mm-hmm.
that you kind of have to forgive,
Yeah.
but it makes it easy to do that.
Well,
That's what
but
I like
like
about
that's
the
all
movie.
just premise because like what I think is great about this is that it sets up the premise, which is there's money in the safe. The safe is in the panic room. When the criminals break into the house, Jodie Foster and her kid hide in the panic room, and so now it's a game of cat and mouse where the burglars are stuck because they can't leave because now they're caught, and so they're feeling like if we leave, we're already busted. So we only want to leave if we have the money. But the money is in the one place that we can't get to right now. And vice versa. The people who are in the panic room know that like it so they're at this perfect little impasse. And so it's this game of cat and mouse of like them trying to outmaneuver one another, and it's just I think the movie is really just a great tight little thriller that doesn't cheat the premise and uses has some really creative uses of this house. And some of the things like we were just saying, like how much money is in this safe that theoretically nobody else knows about. Also, they have to kind of establish that the husband that Jodie Foster is leaving must be extremely wealthy because otherwise, why is the newly divorcing mom moving into this enormous house with just her and her daughter in the middle of New York? It is a ridiculous house. I mean, it's very cool, a cool setting for a movie, but certain like this has to be like this is like if not billionaire, at least multi-millionaire level income to have the moving out wife have this be the place that she moves into when she's leaving her husband.
Right, because it's unnecessary. Like, it wouldn't be, even if you were in a real life, if you were that rich, unless you were just trying to do it to spite your husband, like,
Mm-hmm.
even then you wouldn't move into this house with
Yeah,
just you and your,
it's like a
like, it's just,
four-bedroom house with an elevator in the and a yard in the middle of New York City for just a mom and her daughter. It's kind of silly, but at the same time, it's fine because that's all just premise. Like it's the whole storytelling rule is like if you're gonna have coincidences in your movie, put them at the beginning because then they're the reason that the story happens. But then you don't have to, you don't cheat at the end, right? And so once you establish that this is the situation, the movie just really plays it well. So you've got Jodie Foster and Kristen Stewart in the panic room. The criminals, you've got Jared Leto as Junior, who is the guy who knew about the money and is therefore hiring the Forrest Whitaker, who worked at the security company who built the panic room and is having child custody issues. Presumably, is the like they don't go into detail about it, but that it's suggested that's why he needs the money is to pay lawyers for that.
right.
And then Dwight Yoakam as Raul, who is the extra guy that Junior decides to bring at the last minute, who brings a gun to a burglary where nobody's supposed to be there. And Forrest Whitaker is angry about that. Raul is obviously a loose cannon. Junior is obviously a spoiled rich kid who doesn't know what he's talking about. And it's just a recipe for disaster. And of course, it just all plays out. And it's a great little movie. It's very clever, I think.
It's very clever. Like, a lot of the tools that they use to kind of like maneuver, like why they can't just sit in the panic room and wait till the
Mhm.
cops come. Like the fact that Forrest Whitaker worked for the company and like didn't
Mhm.
send the police the thing, and that he has ways that he can try to force them out through gas, and
Mhm.
the fact that she's diabetic and so needs a medicine. Of course, you didn't bring that when you first went in. Like
Mhm.
it creates these situations where that keep things moving.
Mhm.
And then what really drives the movie is what you just described, is they built these interesting characters
Mhm.
that it all makes sense in the way the movie explains why they're all there.
Mhm.
Like you said, why is Jodie Foster by herself in this giant house with her diabetic daughter? Why is the spoiled rich kid doing this? Why is
Mhm.
Forrest Whitaker, who's supposed to be, who's this really nice guy who doesn't like doing things against the law and against the rules,
Mhm.
doesn't like the loose cannon? Why is he there? And why is this other crazy
Mhm.
mofo there?
Yeah.
And and how they all interact with each other, and how it
Mhm.
leads to all the things that end up happening because Raul does crazy stuff, and Forrest
Yeah.
Whitaker doesn't like it, but he also doesn't know what to do. And then Jared
Yeah.
Leto at one point is like, you know what, this is getting too hard. I
Yeah.
just leave.
Well, especially when he's kind of like he has slipped up a couple of times because there's one point where he has told them there's supposed to be $3 million in there. And then once he's gotten his face burned and he's pissed off, he's kind of starting to say like he's going to leave but he's talking himself into leaving by saying, "Well, if I just wait until they find it later, I'll still probably inherit like eight or $900,000." And like he's doing this whole math thing, and they're saying, "Wait a minute, there is no way that math makes sense. If it's $3 million in there, there has to be more. So how much more is there that you didn't tell us about? And were you going to? Huh? Were you? Were you really?" And also now you're giving up anyway because you're gonna get $800,000 or $900,000 anyway, and you're just gonna leave us here, like, so. But like there's just great stuff that like all of the different twists and turns are motivated by character and situation in ways that feel right in the moment.
Yes.
Yeah, and none of them, like, to one extent, Raul is deliberately written to be kind of a wild card.
Yeah.
But that's okay because he's so well characterized as that wild card that he is able to like, and yet even when he is doing his wild card things, we understand why, right? We can understand he's crazy and maybe dumb for some of the things he's doing, but at the same time we get what his thinking is. It doesn't feel random. It doesn't feel nonsensical. Like one of the big early conflicts, other than just him being there, is when Forrest Whitaker is saying we're going to put some propane into the panic room, and his thinking is we're going to prove to them we can do this, and we could kill you this way if we wanted. So come out, and we won't. Right? Like that's what he's thinking the plan is there. But Dwight Yoakam is basically just saying, you're not using enough. They're not going to believe you. You have to use more. And Forrest Whitaker's trying to say, look, man, if you make them pass out, how are they going to open the door? And then his response is, they're going to throw up before they pass out. But, and again, it's like, it isn't a smart idea, but you understand where he's coming from, right? Like it doesn't feel random or contrived in the way that it might in a lesser movie. And so basically the movie is just kind of all of the ins and outs of them trying to outsmart each other, at some point exchanging positions where the bad guys are now in the panic room and Jodie Foster is outside, and just all the clever little things that they try. And sure, there's a few things that are a little weird, like there is nothing in the emergency food supplies in the panic room that can satisfy, like serve the purpose of an orange juice for a diabetic kid. Like there's nothing with sugar in it. That seems unlikely. It would be pretty poor emergency supplies. Although it's certainly also true that it's emergency supplies that like it's whatever was left in there, right? Like she hadn't stocked it or anything. So I suppose
Yeah,
there's
but I
there's
can't imagine it was depleted by
well,
people
it's
using
a little
but
unclear why any of it would have been in there if it's not the regular stuff for it, right? But at the same time, what we might imagine is that like any of like the stuff that might have been more perishable might have been taken out, and all that was left is literally just MREs or something like that. But at the same time, even an MRE would be better than nothing if the problem is low blood sugar.
yes. Well, and that's, I mean, just in emergency supplies in general, like something with like glucose in it is
Yeah,
definitely going to be in your emergency supply
right.
because
So
even
there's
if you're non-diabetic, like that's a serious concern. Like
yeah,
under stress and under duress, like
right.
blood sugar crashes like mess you up. Like
Oh
you
yeah.
need to have that. So anyway, but
Right, so
that's
it's a real problem. It's just surprising that the food supplies in a panic room, which are designed to help you survive in there a long time if you need to stay, like that. Why wouldn't that have some anyway? But that's like those things are minor concerns ultimately because the whole thing's just kind of it's kind of just fun watching them try to outsmart each other.
no. What I think I love the most about this movie, and this kind of be my last thing to say about it, and then from me, my perspective, we can probably move to the next. Is this movie kind of feels like a play
Mm-hmm.
because it's so done on the characters. But then what makes it cool is they've injected all of the style of having the cameras and the dark and the big house and like how you can maneuver the cameras through the
Yeah,
and
yeah.
how he's done like the thing where he moves through the floor and all
Mm-hmm.
that. Like it's like he basically took a play and put it on like movie steroids, and that's what like where I think is kind of the underrated aspect of it
Oh yeah,
because
absolutely agree. And like, so this is what I was talking about a little bit when we were talked about the stylization and that sort of thing. Because Fight Club, as we talked about, has tons of stuff. Whereas messing with the picture and the way that it looks and the editing is all like jarring and that sort of thing in a deliberate way. Whereas this one, it's like a lot of these shots where it like pans right through a wall or through the ceiling or something like that, or is zooming like over a table where you know like a camera couldn't do that because the table would be in the way, right? You know, and using CGI to do those sorts of shots are designed to be kind of invisible at the same time that we know effects are necessary to create them,
yeah,
right? And it's very cool, and they get a lot of very effective use out of those things. And I remember at the time that this movie was new, those sorts of things were not like common. Those sorts of shots were like, you know, you go to this movie and you're like, whoa, look at that. These are shots that are unlike things that I have seen before. And so yeah, there's a lot of really cool stuff there that allows them to make such excellent use of this big house that they establish early on. Like here's the different where the different rooms are and where people are staying, and this is where the panic room is, and this is how the stairs work in the elevator, and so on. But then when they want to, instead of, you know, they can have what feels like one shot looking at Forrest Whitaker on the second floor and then just track up right through the floor to see someone else on the third floor. And so it's just able to create what feels like single shots out of what wouldn't have actually been. It's very cool.
yes.
Okay, so then we want to. So if we went from Panic Room, there's a couple of other like he never really stops doing the music videos. There's several more of those, but then in 2007 we come back to Zodiac, which is a serial killer movie, sort of, about the Zodiac killer. And I say sort of just because, although it shares a lot of similarities with the typical serial killer genre, it's actually much more about the investigation side, like even beyond just the idea of a thriller that's about the hunt for a serial killer. It's really more about like you've actually got an investigation that's not easy, right? And it's not like, oh no, you got to solve it because who's the next person to die, you know, and you got to rescue the person who's trapped in a basement. It's more like he stopped sending letters. What are we gonna do? Do we, like we have no more clues. There's no more leads to follow. What are we going to do? Right? And years go by, right? And so dealing with all of that, and the thing that really struck me watching Zodiac is just how, even from just like 15 minutes in, this movie is just super watchable. It's just, it's extremely easy on the eyes in almost a soothing way. Like everything looks great, even when it's showing is a shitty 70s police station office, like but it just, everything looks perfect, and the editing is all just very smooth in a way that's like smooth but not slick, right? It all just feels kind of effortless in a way that I found kind of remarkable watching it.
Yeah, and so the odd thing with me is I feel like that almost it didn't distract me. That's not the right word, but it I feel a hard time getting into this movie.
Hmm.
I've watched it like once when it first came out.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like wanting to watch it again, but I never had until this rewatch.
Mm-hmm.
I fell asleep the first time I started watching it. So then I got up the next night, like went back to where I was and like rewatched the whole thing, and I stayed awake and I was engaged. But it just never
Hmm.
gets me, and
Yeah.
I didn't know why, but what I think it's what you're describing, like almost has a negative impact on my viewing
Like
experiences.
you
Yeah,
wanted that friction.
yeah, like there's not. I mean, yes, but and I think it also doesn't help that I know the end, right?
Hmm.
Like it almost hurts this movie knowing that they aren't going to solve it because they never solved it. They
Yeah.
sort of did, but I mean, but it's technically,
I suppose it does lack the catharsis that we sometimes expect from a serial killer movie.
yeah, like the climax is kind of weird because it I don't know, it just feels manipulated because you know, I don't know, the movie just doesn't connect right with me,
Huh.
and it's not, I don't think it's a fault of the movie. I just don't think, I think sometimes things can be good and just not for you.
Well, I think
You know,
that's certainly true. I found that it was by far the one that I liked the most of the three that we watched, like by a pretty significant margin. And
interesting.
I think part of that was just because, like, I'm not necessarily like huge into true crime or even just like find the serial killer movies in general. Like, I like them fine. I don't avoid them, but it's not, I wouldn't say like I'm especially a fan of the genre or anything like that. It's interesting, of course, that uh, I did. I guess it's not a coincidence that I found myself thinking a lot about the TV show Mindhunter while watching it, because, of course, David Fincher did a bunch of
Did
that show,
Mindhunter. Yep.
and it's very much in the style of this movie, right?
Yep.
Like it's like, so Mindhunter. If you like Mindhunter, you'll probably like Zodiac. Vice versa. It's because they're similar in tone in a lot of respects.
And I would also say the same thing for Mindhunter, is I've given that three shots and
Yeah.
it's just never grabbed me. And it's not because I'm like, this is bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like, this doesn't get me,
Well,
and
it's certainly true, and again, this is not this is like, I hear what you're saying, and so it's certainly true that anyone who hasn't seen this, like, part of what we want to talk about is that although it does have a couple of sequences where we see murders take place, and they are violent, um, by and large, compared to what we would normally think of as a serial killer movie in like the traditional sense of the genre, there's a lot less action. Like, we don't have any like car chases or any fist fights or anything like that in this movie, right? Like, there's a couple of these murders that are almost like not afterthoughts, but just emphasizes how the actual violence of them happens kind of really fast. Like there's some dread leading up to it, and then there's the actual violence part, which is maybe 30 seconds maximum, and then it's done, and that's it, right?
Well, and isn't even there? I feel like there was a line in the movie where they like compared like serial killings to like traffic accidents or something, and basically like they compared it to something where it's like this is so rare but
Mm-hmm.
yet so engaged, like it's so like important that we need to be a part of it or something. I don't know what the
Oh, okay. I guess I'm not remembering a specific exchange, but there's certainly the period in the movie where people are paying a lot of attention because they're, um, when Zodiac starts sending the letters and the ciphers to the newspapers and all of that, right? Like, there's all of that attention, and I mean, like, part of the arc of the movie is that there's a period where he's very active in doing all of that stuff, and that gets everybody scared but also kind of excited, and there's a lot of interest in it and a lot of media attention and all of that sort of thing, and that's how our characters kind of get involved in the first place. But then over time that kind of just you know fades for most people, because even if he's still killing, he's not sending letters anymore, and nobody kind of hears about it, and you're not sure, and it gets a little muddled because it seems clear that there's been a couple of killings that weren't him, but he took credit for them anyway. And then it all just starts feeling like less of the sort of story we expected. And so people lose interest. And so I think, like obviously that's to a large extent based on like this is based on a real story, right? So that is what happened. And as you mentioned, the the movie ends without the traditional catharsis of catching the guy, and either he dies in some gunfight or something like that, or we get to see him go to prison. Instead, like the most we get is that we are pretty sure we've got the guy, or like that we know who it is, even if we can't prove it. And that is the big issue, is that like we are so sure that it's this guy, except we don't actually have enough solid evidence that we could put in front of a courtroom to charge him. Like we're sure, but we could not prove it. And so
and by
we
the
have
time we get like DNA evidence and things that could go back and track all that stuff, he's passed away.
right. Well, they even say in the title card at the end that by the time they actually did get something that they felt was enough to bring him in for questioning, he died of a heart attack before they could do it.
Yeah.
So there was he never actually was put on trial. And then some of the other title cards suggest that like there was evidence after that that even muddled it further, to the extent that he might not have been convicted if he had lived to see trial. But at the same time, it was clear that he was a very strange and dangerous guy, even if he wasn't necessarily the person who killed all of the people in question. But like, so what we have here is, uh, Robert Downey Jr. pre Iron Man, but only shortly pre Iron Man. So he had been back doing movies already since then, because he was in Kiss Kiss Bang Bang before this. So like he was back from his period where he wasn't in movies anymore and was considered a risk because of substance abuse and so on. But he had not yet become the Robert Downey Jr. of today. And we have babyface Jake Gyllenhaal as the perhaps on the autistic spectrum cartoonist. It's not entirely clear. Like they don't go into it, but they certainly make a point several places of showing that he's perhaps not neurotypical in some ways, right?
Right.
Um,
Yeah. It felt like a clear implication of autism
yeah.
without
It
doing
makes me
it.
actually wonder, because the real guy is alive. I wonder if there is any element of that in the real guy, or if that's something, because they don't ever like put a name on it, but they certainly have a suggestion that everyone he works with thinks he's a weirdo. Um,
Yeah.
so, But in any case, like he gets interested, even though he's just a political cartoonist, so he's not like on the beat, the crime beat or anything like that. He's just interested. And so he follows it up. He's working with Robert Downey Jr.'s character, who's a reporter, and then they both kind of interact some with Mark Ruffalo, also pre MCU. Looking, it's weird. So he's like the cop who is the L.A. cop who's on the L.A. part, no, San Francisco, excuse me,
Yeah.
San Francisco part of the case. Um, I thought it was interesting looking at Mark Ruffalo just because, he's certainly become a much bigger star since he was in this. But at the same time, it's weird because he's always had kind of a rumpled persona, right? But he's like differently rumpled in this one somehow. I don't know. Like he weirdly looks older even though he's actually younger in this. I don't know. He's also doing kind of a voice that's different than his persona that he's kind of come to be known for more later. But in any case, so it's a good cast, I think. Um, and I just found, I guess, I found it just sort of refreshing and weirdly kind of soothing to just follow along on the investigation with them. And it does not have the same kind of suspense and tension that most other serial killer movies might. But I just found it really compelling and gripping personally.
So yeah, I agree. Like, and as I said, I agree with you. The first part, like, it is. I do follow along with it. Like, it's I like so. One thing I should say, like, it's not like a movie where I'm bored.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm not like checking my phone. Like, I didn't do any of these things. Like I paid attention to the whole movie. It never. So it didn't bore me, but it didn't grab me. It's
Yeah.
like a weird, kind of a weird feeling, right? Like
Yeah,
where
like
I paid attention and watched the whole thing, and I never sat there and said this sucks or I'm not enjoying this. But when I kind of finished, I was just kind of like, okay, well, I'm done with
see,
that.
like when I put it on, I was actually feeling kind of stressed and headachy, and then it felt almost like soothing in that way. Like it just felt like I just let this movie just carry me away. And I felt like I really liked that feeling while watching it. Even though, because obviously the idea of hunting a serial killer is not like a calming subject matter necessarily, but just in the sense that I felt like I was in capable hands watching it, and I could trust the movie to just tell me its story, and I didn't have to worry about it. That's kind of what it felt like. But I mean, obviously
Well,
that's yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think we're on similar spectrums of the same feeling. It's just
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's just left us both feeling different, and like I said, I think that's okay. Like
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's a bad movie. I liked it. I don't feel like I wasted my time watching it again. I think comparing it to Fight Club and Panic Room, though, for me, which are exhilarating movies that are just
Mm-hmm.
like fun, like just to engage in and like dive into that story, like those felt different. And honestly, like we can bring it up one last time. I was reading the Fight Club book like
Yeah.
on book ending when I was watching this movie, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like so I would finish that movie and I'd pick up Fight Club and read the end of it. And it's like maybe that impacted it. I don't know.
Yeah. Hmm. Anyway, so I guess uh, and it sounds like we don't necessarily have a lot more to say about it. So
I mean
do
it yeah, I mean I don't mean that in a bad way. I think
you know,
it exists. It's a good movie.
I'm.
I think people should watch it. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that people will fall somewhere along the lines of where you and I fall. Like they'll enjoy sort of
Mm-hmm.
that like procedural, like soothing aspect of it, or
Mm-hmm.
they'll just say I enjoyed that, and I'm okay with moving on to something else. Like,
Yeah, all right.
and I don't think either is like I said, it's neither is bad. The movie is what it is.
Yep.
So
I was left feeling like it made other serial killer movies feel trashy by comparison.
No, okay, I mean that's fair. I'll agree with you on that.
Yeah.
I think it definitely does that part well.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Like it
other
didn't
than
feel
other than seven,
well. I mean,
but seven's
see,
kind of a
no,
different
well,
serial killer.
like it.
Yeah,
This is a tone question, not necessarily a quality question. Because like Seven, I think. I mean, I haven't watched it in a long time, but I mean, I think it's a good movie, but it's going for a very exploitative tone, right? Like that's what it's doing that on purpose.
yes,
Whereas Zodiac feels to me like almost the antithesis of that approach,
yes,
where it is more interested in the newspaper man and the cop having dinner at a diner or at a bar, and the bit where it's kind of like Robert Downey Jr. is looking at this ridiculous blue drink that Jake Gyllenhaal has ordered and is like, what is that? And it's like, well, it's called an Aqua Velva. You wouldn't laugh at it if you tried it. And he tries it, and the next thing we see is they both have three empty glasses of it on the table in front of them. Like, Zodiac is more interested in that,
yeah,
them having this conversation about the case while that stuff's going on. It's more interested in that than in grossing us out because of what a serial killer did.
yes. That I will agree with you with. I think it it very much is focused on it. Like to your point, it's almost like more interested in the times where it's not exciting to the
Mm-hmm.
rest of the community,
Yeah.
and like these guys who are kind of like
It's really more about like so many serial killer movies, even if the protagonist is the cop or whoever looking for them, the actor, the in the dramatic sense, the protagonist in the sense of who is driving the plot is the killer, right? And the person trying to catch them is entirely reactive. Whereas this feels more like the killer is doing their thing, but who are the people who will keep looking past when everybody else has lost interest?
right.
Who are the people who will do that, and what effect does it have on their lives? Like
Yeah,
that's this movie's more interested in that than in the gruesome details of the killing.
yes, and I do like that about it. I
Mm-hmm.
will agree with you on that. Yep.
Yeah.
So,
All right. Well,
all right.
we've kind
What
of
next?
run a little late, but that's all right. So we could certainly touch on other things that David Fincher has done, but let's just go ahead and jump. I think what we've decided is that our next filmmaker to focus on will be we'll be heading down under to talk about Baz Luhrmann. Um, in particular, we just finished up our Oscar marathon and talked some about his product, his production, I guess, is his movie Elvis. But I think the movies we've selected, we're gonna go not all the way back to the beginning exactly because he did Strictly Ballroom first, but we're gonna talk about Romeo plus Juliet.
Which is honestly what put him on the map. I mean, come on.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, I mean, I think Strictly Ballroom was good enough that it got him money to make the next one, and then the Romeo and Juliet is what like made people really pay attention.
Yep.
And then Moulin Rouge was the first one that really kind of like I liked Romeo and Juliet, but Moulin Rouge I adored. And I think I would actually probably watch that movie much more frequently, except for the fact that it just crushes me at the end every time. Um, but in any case, we're going to watch Romeo and Juliet and Moulin Rouge. And then I think it's interesting to talk sometimes about the movies that are maybe less well beloved. We're gonna watch Australia, and maybe we will find that we love it, but maybe it will be a discussion of okay, he did these two great movies, so what went wrong here?
Yes.
So we will. Those are the next three movies: Romeo and Juliet, Moulin Rouge, and Australia. So in the meantime, watch good movies, everyone.
Watch good movies.